Welcome, everyone. It's April 6th, 2010. This is What on Earth is Happening, and I'm your host, Mark Passio. So last week, we really began by getting into what is truth. We got into talking about how the quality of our lives is basically dictated by how much we harmonize with what actually is, with looking at what actually is and dealing with it effectively, coming into harmony with truth. The quality of our life will improve if we do that. If we do not do that and we sway away off the path of truth, the quality of our life decreases and we experience more and more suffering. This is simply how natural law works. We talked about problem solving, how if we're really to solve any given problem, we have to have enough information about the nature of the problem, about what the causal factors are of the problem that we're experiencing. If we don't have accurate and enough information about what caused the problems, we're going to be essentially powerless to solve those problems. So we have to look at the darkness, so to speak. We have to look at the so-called negative information of what is actually causing and creating the problems that we experience around us. We have to turn and confront those things and get down to the nature of the causal factors of the problem that we're experiencing if we ever hope to solve them. We also talked about that there's really only two reasons that people suffer. They suffer because they accept information which simply is not true, and they refuse to accept information which is true. So our ability to tell truth from falsehood is the most critical capability that the human race possesses in regards to what we experience and the quality of our existence. We also talked a little bit about the fundamental axioms, A-X-I-O-M, an axiom, the fundamental axioms that people hold in their lives that they refuse to let go of. They cling to them. An axiom is a proposition or a belief that is regarded generally as already being established, accepted, and self-evidently true. It's just, people just take it as, it just is this way. And unfortunately, most people's fundamental axioms simply are way off basis from the true nature of reality and the true experience as it is actually taking place on this planet. We also got into how important knowledge of self is. We need to understand that we are a reflection of the all. We are a reflection of the whole, of the universe itself. Accurate knowledge of self is accurate knowledge of the universe. We are a holographic, integral part of creation, and getting out of the mess that we're in as a species involves knowing oneself, understanding human consciousness, understanding how consciousness manifests itself, understanding how consciousness can come into balance and harmony, and also understanding how consciousness can become imbalanced and manipulated. So as a large part, an initial part of doing that, what I began to get into last week was the breakdown of the human brain. Understanding the human brain is a big part of understanding human consciousness. So we will finish up with that this week. I'll be going more into the components of the brain, and specifically, I will be talking about how the brain, what happens when the brain becomes imbalanced. So another concept we touched on and really spent some time on last week was a concept that I call the biggest lie. And that is the ideology known as solipsism. That's spelled S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M. S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M. Solipsism. This is the ideology that there is no such thing as truth, that truth cannot be known and it cannot be communicated to others. And this is the biggest lie. And what I'm going to, after I go into some of the aspects of the brain and how the brain works and how it becomes imbalanced, I'm going to revisit the topic of solipsism and then maybe open up some discussion on this, because I want people to understand the ideology that this dangerous, the most dangerous philosophy on earth, what I call the biggest lie, solipsism, leads to. The other ideologies, that if you buy this lie, if you buy into this big lie, the other ideologies that it invariably leads to. So we'll get into that tonight. Human brain essentially has three components. These are the reptile brain, the mammal brain, and the human brain. The reptile brain is otherwise known as the R complex. This is the brain stem. It's responsible for motor skills. It's responsible for our instinct for survival, and it's responsible for what's called the fight or flight response. Making a decision when confronted with a survival situation, whether you want to fight or run away. This is the stress mode of the brain, the stress complex of the brain. Okay? Above that, we had the mammal brain, which is responsible for us being able to experience emotions in the body. This is also called the limbic brain. That's L-I-M-B-I-C, the limbic system. So without the limbic system, a human being would not be able to experience emotion. And then there's the part of the brain that truly makes us human, and that's the human brain, or the neocortex. It's responsible for higher order thought functions, higher order thinking, conceptual thinking, being able to conceptualize ideas, think at a higher level, basically experience reason, compassion, logic, creativity, language, science, art, music, all of the things that essentially separate us from the animal kingdom and make us truly human. That's the human brain. So, we study the neocortex further, and we discover that it basically has two halves, two hemispheres. It has a left hemisphere and it has a right hemisphere. It's bilaterally symmetrical, meaning if you break it right down the middle in half, it looks the same on both sides. But there's a left side and a right side. And the left side has certain functions and qualities that it makes possible in human thought and behavior. So the left brain functions, they function like the male component of the brain. Okay? This is the male side of consciousness. The left brain is logic, science, language, analytical thought. That's essentially what the left brain governs. So it deals with everything that is rooted in the physical world. Look at it like that. This is the world of matter. This is the world of words. This is language. This is dealing with everyday physical situations, tasks, okay, movement, things in your visual field, in your sensory field. The left brain basically handles all of those functions and deals with all of those things. So this is the male side of the brain, and it's the side of the brain that deals largely with the physical world and physical stuff. The other hemisphere of the brain is the right brain. And this part of the brain governs holistic thought functions. It's the feminine side of the human brain. It governs the feminine, holistic, intuitive, nurturing qualities of the individual. It also governs our ability to be creative beings, to engage in art and music and dance and things like that. Anything that is creative and expressive. This is the right side of the brain. So it's the sacred feminine part of the brain. It's the counterpart to the masculine left brain. Neither one of these hemispheres should dominate the other, given a perfect situation, given a brain that's working as it should, given a brain that is balanced. It's important that we work with and develop all of those brain functions. It isn't that one side is good, one side is bad, that we should be all one way, or all the other, all left brain or all right brain. The idea is to have all of those functions in our repertoire of thinking, so to speak. Okay? We need to engage in all of them in balance. That's the key to a properly functioning brain and to really bringing consciousness online, so to speak. Okay? Now, what I want to talk about here before we get into some other topics, I want the listenership to understand what happens if we engage in only left brain functions or only right brain functions. And what I mean by that, it's not necessarily only, but let's use the term in complete imbalance, that a person is largely engaged or living in, quote unquote, the left brain functions. They don't really engage in the right brain functions. Let's take that as the first example. So we talked about that there are three complexes of the brain and what they do and what they make possible. If a person, through their interactions with other people, through the media that they take in, through the kind of material that they look at, through their general behavior with other people around them, through their general experience in the world, if they become a person that largely engages only the physical world, never the creative, the intuitive, and the spiritual side of things, the left brain completely dominates the neocortical functions of the brain. Okay? And the right brain suffers as a result of this. Now, these two parts of the brain are connected. They're not really separate. They're connected through kind of a bridge in the middle of the brain, in the middle of the head, that goes in between the two hemispheres. This is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. It sends information back and forth between the two hemispheres of the brain if the brain is working properly. If the left brain is chronically engaged in with little to no right brain activity, so again, the physical, worldly aspect, the part of the brain that deals with all the physical, worldly stuff going on around us, okay? Things, events, matter, and just pure everyday occurrences. And there is no deeper thought to anything that is holistic or creative or spiritual. Something happens to the entire neocortex. The whole neocortex starts to basically malfunction, and it starts to not act any longer in its intended role. So what I mean by that is the intended role of the neocortex, of the higher order thought center of the brain, the human brain as it is known, will become destabilized to a point where it will not act as the executive command center of the whole brain complex, the three complexes of the brain. So how you should look at this, or an easy way to understand this, is to just envision any company. A company has an executive officer that makes the executive command decisions about the direction that that company or business or organization is going to be going in. They're the CEO, okay, the chief executive officer. They execute, they make the basic decisions that execute the direction that the company is going to go in. If that CEO were suddenly to become so ill that he could not fulfill his obligations or responsibilities to the company, middle management would have to step in and take over those responsibilities. So let's look at the neocortex as this CEO of this company, and let's look at the other two brain complexes that are not as advanced, that are not as complex, that do not have the same capabilities as the neocortex, as middle management, junior management. Okay, let's look at it like that. Now, if the CEO, the neocortex, has become destabilized because it has gone into a state of left brain hemispherical imbalance, the left brain hemisphere becomes completely dominant over the right brain hemisphere. What happens is one of the other two complexes will start to assume executive control over the whole brain, and therefore essentially over the behavior of the individual. So I'll say that again. If the left brain hemisphere becomes completely dominant, one of the other two complexes in the brain, since the neocortex has now become damaged, it actually has become physically damaged. Neurons don't fire in the proper way. Neural connections aren't made in the proper way, and the areas of the brain actually become darkened. There is no electrochemical and neural activity in certain areas of the brain that there should be chemical and electrical activity if the neocortex is functioning properly and making good, reasonable executive decisions. Okay? So what happens when the left brain becomes dominant is the limbic brain, or the emotional brain, suffers the most, and it starts to shut down, not function as it should, by sending the chemicals that help us to experience our emotions into the body. Therefore, the person becomes largely emotionless and not truly capable of experiencing emotion in the same way that a healthy, holistically functioning brained person would experience and feel emotions in the body. This person then becomes governed, becomes owned by the R complex, the reptilian brain. Think about this now. Follow this through. The left brain, the part that deals with only the physical world, no consideration to the spiritual, no consideration to the intuitive, no consideration to the creative. If that dominates the person's thoughts, the emotional center of the brain, the limbic brain, suffers the most, and the reptilian lower brain, the brain stem, the R complex, the survival, stress, and fight or flight part of the brain takes over the entire consciousness of the individual's brain. It becomes the governing or executive controller of the brain, and the person is essentially living in the reptile part of the mind. That should explain a lot to a lot of people if they're paying attention about what is actually happening in our world, if you're paying attention at all. Now, a lot of people are imbalanced to the left side of the brain. I would say more people than are not. Most people probably have this form of brain imbalance in one form or another, to one degree or another. I want to talk about now what happens when the right side of the brain dominates. Okay, so now this is the spiritual or nurturing or feminine or intuitive side of the brain, the right brain hemisphere. If a person lives chronically in these types of thought functions and never really engages the physical reality, They're constantly in a high state of mind, constantly in the spiritual. They're never rooted. They're never grounded. Okay? They just don't really consider what's happening in the physical domain very important. They're always thinking of the other world. They're always thinking of the world to come. Okay? Or they're just always, wanting to live for basic pleasure, for, to not ever look at anything that is so-called dark or negative. They don't really want to engage problems. They want, to engage in escapism. Okay? Something also happens in the whole brain complexes, in all three of the complexes. When the right side of the brain becomes chronically dominant, what we see happen is the limbic brain. It is basically the exact reverse situation that I described, of the situation that I described earlier when the left brain becomes dominant. When the right brain becomes dominant, the limbic brain, or the emotional part of the brain, basically runs haywire. The exact reverse of when the left brain becomes dominant. The emotional brain shuts down in that instance. When the right brain is dominant, a person is essentially a slave to their feelings and emotions. They can't really control that which is going on within them. They either live in fear, or they become somebody who really can't discern truth because they'll believe whatever they're told. They become far too passive. Okay? The left brain imbalance makes someone become far too aggressive. But right brain imbalance makes someone become far too passive, essentially allowing themselves to be walked on. This is because when the brain becomes imbalanced in this way, the reptile brain, okay, the R complex of the brain, essentially is shut down. It's the exact reverse of the other kind of brain imbalance. So when the left brain is dominant, the limbic brain, the emotional brain, shuts down, and the person becomes governed by the reptile brain, the R complex. When the right brain hemisphere becomes dominant chronically, the exact reverse takes place. The reptile brain that governs instinct and survival, okay, that part shuts down, and the person lives in. The part of the brain that takes over the consciousness is the limbic system. This person basically has runaway emotional states. Okay, so let's look at some of the qualities and worldviews that come into being when one of these states of consciousness takes over. When one of these forms of brain imbalance or another occurs. Well, when a person becomes completely imbalanced chronically to the left brain hemisphere, the male part of the brain, they become a dominator. They want to control other people. They want to control other people's actions, the decisions that they make over their lives. Okay? They'll often become physically aggressive toward other people, okay, if they don't get their way. So this is the master form of brain imbalance. I call this the schism of the mind. And it happens right behind people's forehead. Right behind your eyes is where this takes place. And just about everybody out there has one form of brain imbalance or the other, toward the left or to the right, and in some cases both. Okay? The right side of the brain, when that becomes chronically imbalanced, you get all of the slave tendencies of the brain. So a person becomes engaged in feelings of unworthiness when the right brain is chronically dominant and the limbic brain has taken over the consciousness. A person will become self-loathing, never thinking that they're good enough or worthy. Unworthiness, self-loathing. A lot of times, addictive tendencies will creep in. A person will become an addict of one form or another if their right brain is completely dominant. And they'll become basically people who are willing to follow whatever orders they're given and become a willing slave. That's essentially the consciousness mode that people in right brain modality will eventually go into. So one form of brain imbalance, the left brain hemispherical imbalance, creates a master type, okay, or a slave driver type, a dominator. And the other form of brain imbalance essentially creates somebody who is willing to be dominated, a slave. This explains just about everything that we are experiencing in this time in human history. Just about. Okay? This, if we really understand this dynamic, and there are those out there who will say this is reductionism, this is too simple. It's more complex than that. Well, not really. The way the brain functions essentially determines how we behave and what we experience in the world. If we don't take care of the temple in man, the temple in you, we're going to experience negative consequences because we're not taking care of the greatest gift that has ever been gifted to our species. We're letting it fall into states of dysfunction and disarray. And when we do that, we're going to get unpleasant, uncomfortable results. We really have to understand how we work, because there are a lot of other people that sure as hell understand how we work, and they're using it as a weapon against us. And most of us are completely uneducated as to how those methodologies of mind control really work. The pineal gland is what essentially becomes awakened and active when the two hemispheres of the neocortex act in unison and balance. So that gland actually activates higher levels of awareness, but it only really comes online when we bring the male side of the brain and the female side of the brain together in balance and harmony, in unison. Neither one is dominant over the other. They work in balance. If you put together the basic archetypal symbolism for male and female, yin and yang, okay? Or yang is male, yin is female. Yang is represented by an upward pointing equilateral triangle. It's an archetypal symbol that in ancient human history has generally been referred to as the blade. And the inverted equilateral triangle, okay, is an archetypal symbol that represents the sacred feminine, or the chalice, the womb, so to speak, okay? And that's called the chalice. So if you put these two together, you get the Seal of Solomon. And the Seal of Solomon represents the left brain hemisphere in unison with the right brain hemisphere. This is also known as the Star of David in Judaism. But an older name for it is the Seal of Solomon. And right in the word Solomon, you have the sun and the moon, soul and mon. What we've been doing in the first hour is kind of reviewing some topics, and we talked about the human brain a lot in this segment, and how the brain becomes imbalanced toward one brain hemisphere or another, and what that basically creates in our experience. We also discussed what happens when we diverge from an understanding of what actually is taking place in the world, when we refuse to acknowledge and admit truth into our lives, how the human experience becomes degraded when that happens. And when we come into harmony with truth, and when we accept it and basically live according to the principles of natural law, the human experience essentially flowers, opens up, and really becomes something that is really worth participating in and of a much higher quality than if we exist at lower levels of consciousness. We were talking about the pineal gland a little bit. This is intricately related to structures in the brain, and this is really related to brain balance. So in the last hour, we talked about brain imbalance. Okay, let's talk about what happens when the brain hemispheres are balanced. Okay, so when you bring the left and right brain hemispheres into conjunction, into unison, into harmony, one brain hemisphere is not dominant over the other. You have a balanced brain. The human neocortex, the higher order thought center of the human brain, acts in its proper role as the executive command center, the executive functions of the whole brain complex. Okay? That is as it is intended to be. That is a healthy, functional, fully functional human brain. The person isn't governed by an out-of-control emotional state, nor are they governed by total fight-flight response and stress mode and the desire to control other people. So when the brain is balanced, a person is neither a master nor a slave, not a master of others, nor a slave of others. They are a master of themselves. They have achieved a state that I call dominion. This is self-ownership, self-governance, self-rulership. In other words, that being isn't divided anymore amongst themselves. As they think, so they feel, and so they act in unison. The three modalities of consciousness, thought, emotion, and action, come into harmony with each other. And the third eye, or what has been called the one eye, the all-seeing eye, the human pineal gland, which is exactly in the center of the head. It's inside what's called the middle chamber, which is the limbic brain. So the limbic brain has a lot of different components in it. The emotional part of the brain that generates the chemicals that help us to feel the emotions that we experience in the body. You have the hypothalamus is in the limbic brain. You have the hippocampus. You have the amygdala. You have the pituitary gland. And you have the pineal gland. So this is like a cone-shaped gland directly in the center of the head. If you looked at a person straight on, right at their face, it would be a little bit above the eyes, right in the middle of the head. So right in between the forehead, in between the eyes, on the forehead, and then go backwards and locate the approximate center of the skull. And right there you would find the human pineal gland, named because it is shaped like a pine cone, pineal gland. Okay? This gland becomes active and essentially awakens a human being to higher states of awareness about what is actually taking place within and around them. So they become able to discern, to have true discernment when this state of consciousness opens up. And this is done by balancing the brain hemispheres. So we will get into the techniques, different techniques to make this state of consciousness occur. And I have a whole series of solutions that helps balance the human brain and the human consciousness and bring them into unison. So I want to talk about some symbology associated with this state. I touched on it a little bit last hour. There's a couple of symbols that have been associated with different modes of consciousness for thousands of years. One of them is the male aspect of being, okay? The male side of the consciousness, what's called the yang energy. And the general symbol that this form of consciousness was, the symbol that was used to describe this modality of consciousness was called the blade. This is an upward pointing triangle. It's a rudimentary phallic symbol representing the male phallic organ. Okay? This is associated with action, with anything that goes outside of oneself and interacts with the world around oneself. It is the active male component. And the reason that it's associated with a phallic symbol is because that is the thrust force. That is the force through which we project outward to others around us, our actions in the world. Okay? This is associated, the symbol is associated with the left brain hemisphere. Okay? An upward pointing triangle. The reversal of that symbol, of this archetypal, okay? This means just a general form is what archetypal means. It's rooted deep in the subconscious. It is just something that we intuitively recognize and are aware of at very deep subconscious levels. So it's an archetypal symbol, okay? The inverted triangle, the point is pointing downward, okay? So this is a rudimentary womb symbol. Okay? It is shaped like the feminine womb. This inverted triangle is known as the chalice in different ancient symbolic systems. This is the sacred feminine energy. This deals with emotional states. It deals with the right brain hemisphere. Okay? This is the part of the part of the consciousness that is looks inward. Okay? This is the internal aspect of consciousness. So it is largely dealing with our emotional states. And when we bring these two together, we have a very recognized symbol in different cultures. And it's been used throughout the world to describe the state of consciousness when one has a balanced brain. Now, that's not always the way it's used, but in general, that is the archetypal symbol known as the Seal of Solomon. And it is the interlocked, not one on top of the other, not, both of them completely intersecting, the interlocked blade and chalice. This state of consciousness is often called the chemical wedding, because the chemical and electrical activity of the human brain is functioning in wholeness, in oneness, in harmony. And it's called the Seal of Solomon because the male side of the brain is representative of the active solar yang energies. Okay? The action is associated with the sun and daytime. So the word for the sun is soul, solar energy. Soul, S-O-L. And then we have the lunar form of consciousness, the feminine, the sacred feminine consciousness. This is the moon energy, the right brain. So when they come together, it's the chemical wedding. It's the state of a balanced brain and the beginning of the awakening of the pineal gland, or the all-seeing eye. We'll talk a lot more about that symbolism as we go forward. And that's the Seal of Solomon, the six-pointed blazing star, as it is known. And that is the symbol to represent that state of consciousness that I think we need to ascribe to. We need to make that our goal if we're really going to come out of, again, the problems that we're facing as a species. We really need to work on ourselves, work on, again, what different mystic traditions have called the temple inside mankind. Okay? And that's the human brain. I can't stress it enough. It is really the underlying focus, the underlying causal factor of what generates our experience in the world. And this is not reductionist thinking or reductionist philosophy. It can't be overstated. It can't be over calculated how important the brain is to what we experience. Yet you see people doing all kinds of crazy, destructive behaviors to the brain through substance abuse, through engaging in activities that will damage the brain irreparably, riding a motorcycle without a helmet. You know, how about cage fighting, you know, or even boxing? Not much respect for the temple in man. Individuals like that don't have. To desecrate a gift like that for whatever justification or money or paycheck you might be getting, I can't personally see it. The brain is too precious to me. I understand what it makes capable. I understand what the brain generates, the experience that it generates in the so-called external world that we experience. You know, it's all a reflection of what's going on inside us. It really is. So I think I'll leave the exploration of the brain there for now. What I'm also going to start breaking down and really getting into now is what I call the big lie. And I talked about this last week, and I'm going to break down this concept even further this week. And that's the ideology known as solipsism. So I'm going to spell that again for people that want to look into it and research it a little bit. And again, I can't overestimate how dangerous this ideology is. This is the ideology that leads to all the other dangerous and destructive worldviews that people hold in the world that lead to more and more human suffering. Solipsism. S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M. Something that maybe perhaps not many people have heard of, but if you listen to this show, you are going to hear about solipsism, because this is what I call the biggest lie. This is the lie that if you buy into, essentially, the spiritual journey comes to a halt. It really does. Because the spiritual journey is about seeking truth. That's what it really is ultimately about. And if you buy into the notion that there is no such thing as objective truth, which is what solipsism claims, this is the notion that perception is reality. That's solipsism. Perception dictates reality. So however I perceive it, that's what the truth is. The truth isn't something that I discover. It's something I basically make up based on my personal preferences, what I'm comfortable with, and the information I have at any given moment. And this is the ideology called solipsism, that nothing really exists independently of the individual who is observing anything. Okay? There's no external reality. There's no external truth. Whatever I decide is the truth, essentially that's what I'm going to, how I'm going to live my life according, what I'm going to live my life according to. What I describe this as is someone attempting to become their own personal arbiter of truth. The arbiter of truth. That's what the solipsist is. The person who subscribes to the notion that there is no such thing as objective truth, that nothing can be known in and of itself, that only perception governs reality. This is the most dangerous ideology that exists on earth. And talk to people. More people believe in and subscribe to this ideology than you would ever believe or imagine. This ideology is out there. This ideology is totally lived by towards so many people, through so many people, that you would be shocked and appalled if you understood how many people really subscribe to this. Okay? And if you're a subscriber to that ideology, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, there's no point in you even bothering listening to this show. You might as well turn it off now. I could teach you nothing until you come out of that state of mind. If you don't believe that there is actual events that take place and they can be known, and that's called the truth of what happens on this planet, on the earth, then there's really no helping you. You need to use your will to come out of that state of mind, because there is nothing else that can really be said about it except that it's complete nonsense. It needs to be thoroughly renounced and rejected. There is such a thing as truth. It is that which is. If you want to get real scientific and technical about it, how I refer to the truth is, it is the wave functions that are spoken of in quantum mechanics, the waves of possibility. Okay? All the possibilities that existed in what we know of as the past, that have coalesced, that have condensed, that have collapsed, and become actual events in the now, in the present moment. That's what the truth is. It's that which has actually already occurred, that which has undergone the formality of actually taking place and occurring in the world. I believe that's how Alfred North Whitehead described what he termed the truth. Okay? It is that which has undergone the formality of actually taking place. It's not up for debate. It's that which is. It already occurred. It happened. It happened. Now, whether we discover truth is a whole different story. But it exists. And that's the first and only, what I describe as the first and only prerequisite leap of faith that must be taken on the entire spiritual journey. And there is no other belief or faith that is required after that initial leap of faith to believe that there is such a thing as truth. Because at first you don't know that there is such a thing as truth. You do have to have some form of belief that truth exists to go seeking it. You don't have it at first. Okay? A truth seeker doesn't actually already have the truth, otherwise he wouldn't be seeking it. So that's what solipsism is. Okay? Somebody who believes there's no such thing as truth and doesn't really ever begin the spiritual journey. In darker occultic orders and movements, this state of consciousness, and I know this from first-hand experience, is referred to in different ways. Dark occultists who are actively using techniques of mind control upon the general population of this planet they have a name for people who have bought the biggest lie. They have a name for them. They have several names for them, actually. But there is one overarching name that they give to people who subscribe to this ideology. They call them the dead. The dead. Imagine this. There are people out there who refer to living people because of how completely off the mark they are about the nature of the reality in which they live. They call them the dead. And they have another name for the solipsist, the person who thinks they're the arbiter of truth in the world, that truth doesn't really exist. We get to make it up. Our perceptions are what the truth is all about. It's nothing that exists independently of us that we need to discover, but we get to make it up. We're the personal arbiters of our own truth. Okay? It's not something that is objective. It is something that is subjective. I get to decide what's truth based upon whether I like it or not, how I feel about it. Okay? That's what solipsism generally is. And the other name that dark occultists, people who have developed technologies and methodologies to mind control whole populations, the other name that they have for people that subscribe to the philosophy of solipsism is the unbegun. The unbegun, or the uninitiated. Or in other words, those who have not begun. Because subscribing to solipsism means you have not begun the spiritual journey toward truth. And dark occultists want people in that state of consciousness. They want them there. And they have a lot of them there. Okay? So I want to talk about now the ideologies that solipsism leads to. The ideologies that accepting the biggest lie leads to in life and in the world. Okay? Well, if there is no such thing as truth, most solipsists believe that there is no such thing as God. So atheism goes hand in hand with the ideology of solipsism. Some would say atheism is the root of solipsism and solipsistic beliefs, and some would say atheism flows out of solipsism, the idea that there is no truth, therefore there is no God. Or vice versa, there is no God, therefore there is no truth. Okay? Solipsism is the idea that I get to determine, based on my personal preferences, what truth is. Therefore, it leads, inextricably leads, invariably leads, unwaveringly leads to an ideology known as moral relativism. Moral relativism. Solipsism leads to moral relativism. This is the notion that there is no such thing as objective right and wrong. No such thing. Since there is no truth, no objective truth, a solipsist claims, there is no such thing as objective morality. No such thing as objective morality, because after all, if I get to determine what truth is, I also get to determine what morals are. What is moral, what is not moral? It's based on my personal preferences. What's good for me is good. What's bad for me is bad. Doesn't matter how it affects anybody else. I get to make it up. After all, there's no truth. After all, there's no God, so there's no such thing as natural law consequences for our actions and behaviors, right? So that's moral relativism. There's no such thing as objective morality. Morality is completely subjective and based, once again, in the perceptions of the beholder. This is complete and utter nonsense. Nonsense. Of course there is such a thing as moral right and moral wrong. This is why we have so many people taking all the immoral actions that they're taking in the world, stomping completely crazed on other people's natural human rights, as if it doesn't matter what they do to them, as long as a paycheck is flowing in, as long as they can transfer the responsibility to someone else, a commanding officer or a politician or a banker or anyone who signs their paycheck. Okay? This ideology of solipsism invariably, when one subscribes to it, leads to moral relativism. And when you get moral relativism, other interesting things start to crop up. Once you have that, that's the beginning of the slide down into 100% total tyranny. Okay, because if there's no such thing as right or wrong, nothing anybody really does to anybody else matters. So you get ideologies like social Darwinism, the idea that the evolution of the species is determined by the best socially prepared to deal with anything that may be occurring in the culture. So a higher strata or class of society has the right to rule over, conquer, and even kill and destroy lower classes below it. Social Darwinism. You get things like eugenics, killing people based on your assessment of their breeding worth and their gene pool worth, like we saw during the Third Reich in Nazi Germany and other oppressive police state regimes throughout the world. And invariably it leads to totalitarianism and total tyranny. And we're going to get into that more. We'll unpack all of these ideas and concepts as this show progresses, but I'm going to leave it off there for now. I think that's given people a lot of things to think about.